Hello and welcome to the Seatton Education Podcast, where we delve into all things home education with expert guests from around the world. I'm your host, Victoria. Joining me today is Justin McGeary. Justin is from the United States and was home educated as a child. As an adult, he has taught ancient Greek, history, literature, and theology at university level. Having studied for a semester at Oxford University, he has now founded Trinity House Tutorials to bring Oxbridge-style tutorials to gifted, home-educated high school students. Hi, Justin. Thanks so much for being with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Victoria. I am excited about what you guys are doing, so it's great to be here.
Maybe you could start by giving people a bit of an idea about Trinity House Tutorials and your journey to where you are now.
I have taught at the university level. In the States, we have the kind of college system as well, which is sort of a little bit smaller than the larger universities. So that's where I taught for 6 years. And I was thinking then about my time at Oxford, actually. And I thought, you know what? With the internet and with home education, it kind of creates this great opportunity to actually do some of the things that happen at Oxford. So you can now connect with people, right, at different places with, Zoom and these sorts of things. But then you also have so many resources now available online. As a tutor, you can kind of guide them to all sorts of incredible resources. So I tried to bring home education, the internet, and this Oxford tutorial model together. I'm living in the Midwest right now, but I grew up on the East Coast of the States. I've worked in higher education most of the last 20 years. And I've worked at a variety of schools. I've worked at studied anywhere from sort of small local colleges, liberal arts colleges. I did work at a Christian Studies Center at Cornell University.
You and your wife were both home educated, right?
Yeah, we weren't totally home educated. I went to a private school through elementary till I was, I guess, around 11 or 12. At which point, my parents decided to home educate myself and my siblings. And it's interesting, my wife had a somewhat similar story. She went to a private school as well, up through about 8th grade, which I guess would be around 13, at which point she then was home educated for high school. So our story actually is somewhat different from at least what I see here in the States, which is most people are home educated in the early years because I think parents feel more competent for that. And then as students become more, mature, parents will then often send their kids to high school. So we actually did sort of the reverse, both of us.
And so perhaps you can explain why your parents ended up doing that. What was the impetus that drove them, I suppose, to go against that trend, to take you out of school into home education?
We both attended private schools that only went up through essentially elementary, at which point our parents had to make decisions about, okay, what's the next stage? Now, for me, my brother actually, when he was young, around just the earliest elementary years, was diagnosed with leukemia. And so he missed a lot of school going for treatment. And my mom, that was sort of the introduction to home education for her while the rest of us were still going to school. He would go to school when he could. And then when he couldn't, I would bring his homework, and my mom and my aunt would help him with his homework and make sure he wasn't falling behind despite really rigorous chemotherapy. So my mom got exposure that way. I think that it was a bit of a leap of faith for my mom, as well as for my dad. My mom, I think it was mostly a question of confidence. Can we do this? Can I do this? And I think for my dad, there were some concerns about, I think that at the time, homeschooling, home education definitely had some pretty negative stereotypes that I think are still there, but they're less than they used to be as it's become more of a real option, at least here in the States. But I think my dad had concerns about socialization. Are kids going to become weird? I think that, and it was a kind of unknown. Actually,
when is this, Justin? Just so I can situate this.
Oh, when is this time period?
Yeah.
Great question. This would have been about the mid-90s. So I ended up actually taking an entrance exam for kind of the elite preparatory school in our area. I got accepted. But it was very expensive. And so I think that for my parents, it was between that and our public school just had a terrible reputation. And so those were the two options really for my parents. I think that it was a little bit like my mom was like, I want to try this. And my dad, I think, was like, okay, it took him a while. They had been thinking about it before this moment. And I think it was kind of like, well, okay, let's go for it. I think that some of the really good things that came out of it developed over time. So yeah, that's kind of how they got into it.
It's really interesting you pick up on that, because I think we're seeing a very similar situation in the UK at the moment. So we had a new government in the summer of 2024, and they have decided to put value-added tax, VAT, onto private school fees, which traditionally has never happened in the UK.
Yeah.
And so that, and it's a 20% tax. So that is really significant. If you have 2 or 3 children at a school, suddenly you're facing a 60% increase in fees that you didn't have. And this is obviously on top of, as we have all seen, general costs going up year on year. And we're seeing a lot of people say, well, tell us about home education. Because they had chosen the private school system because they weren't happy with the local state provision. But suddenly, in one kind of flip of a switch, which is happening in January 2025, it's just no longer an affordable option.
Yeah. That was definitely the case for my parents.
And I'm interested, you picked up on those concerns that your parents had, particularly your father, which I think are completely natural concerns when you don't know a huge number of home educated people, and particularly, that's why I'm so pleased to speak to you, particularly when you don't know a huge number of people who've the proof of the pudding, if you like, who've gone through the system and come out the other side.
Sure.
How would you now address when people say, what about socialization? And what they really mean by that, I think, is I'm really worried my child is going to be socially handicapped for the rest of their life.
There's part of me that wants to respond by saying, I think that it just shows how little exposure you've had, to home educated people. The truth of the matter is there are kids that struggle with socialization in all sorts of education systems. Why it's kind of seen that homeschoolers, home educated kids are the ones that really turn out weird. I don't know how that's really stuck. I would say that things I've observed are that there's actually they're not usually socially handicapped. And so home educated kids are often spending time with a diverse range of ages, from young children through adults, and often in the context of even beyond, parents to grandparents. And so what that actually allows is for socialization that's way more versatile, I would say, than a kid that spends pretty much, 10 years with the same age kids and one adult in their class, right? So I would say, I guess I kind of like to paint the picture slightly like, okay, let's think about the dynamics here. I would say that some homeschool kids, right, put them in a room with a ton of their peers, may not fit in quite as well as someone who spends 10 years doing just that. But even there, I don't think that they are handicapped. They might not shine in the exact same way. Some of them will. I guess I'm trying to be as honest as possible about that question. But I would say fundamentally, I don't agree. I think that they can interact with a lot of different ages really well. And I would say that conversationally, I'm usually pretty impressed with home educated kids that I meet. And having been a professor, I've definitely tended to see that homeschool kids, at least in the classroom, are very well equipped to just kind of engage in conversation because they're used to having to talk to adults. Even though people might think, well, you just grow up kind of isolated in your home or something. That is definitely not my experience, and definitely generally not what I've seen with home educated kids. I've actually had lots of conversations with my parents about socialization, not because we were homeschooled, but mostly actually coming from my own frustration with my peers. Because at least in our education, my parents really encouraged us to think and engage tough topics. And so I often found that the conversations that I would have with my peers, because my friends were not homeschooled friends, my closest friends in high school, I occasionally would feel frustrated with the level of depth of our conversation. And I distinctly remember having a discussion with my mom about this frustration that I had, that my peers just seemed to want to talk about sort of superficial things. And she introduced me to the power of asking questions in social settings. And that allows you to engage people and learn about people. And maybe you don't get to the deep conversations that you want to have, but you at least learn about and relate to people. My experience is that I found homeschoolers are really good also, not just at interacting with a wide variety of ages. They're also decently welcoming, I think, because there's often, at least here in the States, a decent amount of diversity among homeschoolers. And so I think that the kids are pretty good at welcoming people that aren't exactly like them, interestingly enough, is something I've observed.
That's
so
interesting.
Can you find people that don't fit that and are straight up stereotype, like, wow, socially awkward, have trouble carrying a conversation? Yeah, you can. But I don't think that is the norm. And I don't think that it has to be if parents are also conscious of what they're doing in the home education.
And I suppose, you see those people in mainstream school as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's just different people fit in or don't fit in based on some of the systems that they're placed into,
and picking up on those systems, when you were saying about their natural milieu might not be with 80 other kids their own age, but I suppose you could say actually outside of an education setting, you don't really replicate that again in life.
Yeah, it's true. Our educational systems do not represent most of what people will experience the rest of their lives. I think that maybe there's this concern, right, that homeschooling is some sort of this artificial setting. And you'd say, well, our current educational system is artificial as well. Once you're out of school, right, you're in the workplace, and there's all different types of personalities. They're the gregarious people at the water cooler, and they're the people that will just sit at their desk coding, and they're totally fine with that. And somehow we have to learn how to interact with everybody.
I think it's such a good point that you make, because I think we have this slight obsession at school that everybody has to meet the same yardstick, whether that's academically or socially.
Yeah.
And in adult life, we don't expect that, quite rightly. We appreciate in adult life that people have different skills and talents and personalities. And I think that reflects the school system, that actually we're still measuring by one quite niche version of academic social success, which maybe is just not that useful, because it takes all sorts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I got to college, university, my friends, a number of them were all like, "Whoa, you were home educated?" Like it was like this secret, because they couldn't figure it out by looking at me and how I interacted with people socially, which I always found decently amusing. My parents got all of us involved in activities in home education and non-home education settings. I think home education actually gave us that freedom to move in sort of different spheres, actually.
And you mentioned that point that, of course, it takes intentionality and planning on the part of the parents to ensure. Actually, I would argue whether your children are home educated or
exactly,
not.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah, how they're going to turn out, and that is a great privilege of being a parent. So, that's something that, whether your children are home educated, I would definitely encourage parents to be intentional and thoughtful about the way they are providing opportunities to their children. But would you just speak to what the family dynamic was in your house? And do you feel your parents had a kind of vision for you through home educating you?
I think that my parents, there was a lot of practical things that I think went into their initial decision to homeschool. But I think that over time, I actually watched their develop sort of a vision for home education, which was actually really helpful for me as a child, because I think that watching my parents learn and think through what they were doing, it was sort of like pulling back the curtain and helping me to then myself actually own what it meant to be educated or seek education, to seek to learn, which I would say was probably one of the greatest gifts that my parents could have given to us. As far as the dynamic, for us, I think that it made our family much closer knit. I would consider my siblings to be, some of my closest friends. We do tons of stuff together. My mom was pretty creative, I would say, in trying to find places we could go, museums. So my mom is like a lifelong learner. She's an avid reader. She loves engaging people and topics. And when we go to museums, my mom would read every single thing. And it was a joke that we would be like, we'd be like through the museum or wanting to be through the museum. And my mom's still on, display exhibit 1. But I think getting to watch my mom as someone who loved learning, that was really wonderful. And I think that often with education in general, I'm not talking about home education at this point, we want the next generation to enjoy their learning, but we ourselves maybe don't. My mom was not that way. My mom loved it. So I guess the dynamic as far as what education looked like, initially, we pretty much just replicated school, but at home. So we would have different subjects that we tackled, every 60 minutes or something like that. And as we went further, so to speak, into it, and as my mom and all of us really gained experience, because in one sense, it was like a family project. I think we started to experiment and see how other people were doing things. And because we really only had exposure largely to, okay, this is what we did when we went to school. And so by the end, I think there's more creativity, not in the negative sense of like just doing kind of whatever, but really kind of thinking about what are learning opportunities, what are learning experiences, and how do we design them? Another interesting dynamic that it brings is that sort of life becomes a little more integrated. The idea that really anything can be turned into a learning experience. My dad, so he had kind of reservations initially. I think he saw sort of my mom's kind of educational gifts and her kind of natural inclinations, and did a good job of kind of helping us to be more like your mom. I was a decently successful in-school kid. I got the good grades, but I want people to give me that kind of affirmation. And I think that one of the things my dad was able to help us do was to say, okay, look, we're not here to get grades, right? I mean, I don't think he was trying to say, we don't want you to be successful, or, we don't want to, send you off into the world incapacitated for whatever it might be that you're called to. But he wanted us to not fixate on the grades. He wanted us to focus on the learning and the learning process. And I think that was really, really helpful for me, especially because I would say, in one sense, I was handicapped by the grades.
I think that's a really difficult point to make. And it's something I have wrestled with. And I think you've put it better than I could have put it. That I think there's a tendency when people say, oh, it's a holistic lifestyle. I think sometimes people think that's code for it can't be academic. And I would say, like you, I ticked the right boxes at school. I always say I wasn't home educated, but I was, because actually now as an adult, I realize a lot of the things that have stuck with me, both academic things like my times tables, but also life learnings, I think were taught by my parents, not by my schooling. And I think what you're saying there, which you've really explained beautifully, is that you can get the grades without fixating on the grades. I think a lot of schools, particularly good schools, train so much for the exams that you do just fixate on the grades. I would genuinely say that from the age of about 13 or 14, I went to a good school. We were just prepping for the exams. Everything was to get through the exams. And I have the paper to show for it. I think I'm lucky that I had a parenting approach at home that actually still meant that I loved learning. But I sometimes say, I think that was in spite of doing well in exams rather than because of it.
Yeah. And I think that there are kids that love learning, so to speak, but it's because they get affirmed because they're good at it, not because they necessarily love, like if you were to take away all of the pats on the back, right, and all the, thumbs up, would they keep doing it? Maybe not. And I think that what my parents did for me was, you can, I think, take those things away. And I will still want to read books. I still will want to understand how this or that works. And I think they kind of reignited in me curiosity, I guess is what I would say. So that I think was just a huge gift. And actually one of the practices it did for me was when I went back into the system, so to speak, by going to college, university, was I really tried to not look at my grades after I got papers back or exams. What I tried to look at was the feedback that I would get from faculty in order to see, okay, what can I improve? What did I do well? Trying to focus on those sorts of things rather than quickly looking. I wasn't like completely oblivious to grades or whatever. But it was very helpful for me too. That was something I was constantly trying to do, was to not get kind of sucked back in and lose sight of what am I here for? I'm here to learn to think in these sorts of things.
And I think
to expand my understanding.
I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to ask you actually about. Not everybody will know when you say Oxford style tutorials, not everybody will know what that means. Can you just explain what you understand by that, what we understand by that, and why you think that benefits, in particular, home educated students, why there's this sweet spot?
I'm glad that you asked me to articulate this, because I'm still trying to do this, so I do this class that I call the Oxford Essay Course. And I regularly get, even educators will say, tell me what an Oxford essay is. I think it's at a higher level, but essentially the tutorial, right, is every week the tutor gives the student their essay titles, their questions, and that student then has to go as an independent learner with the resources that they've received thus far and answer that question. And they've drawn the resources of the university, right? There's lectures going on, there's libraries. If you talk with anyone that's home educated for a long period of time, by the time kids hit the high school years, a lot of them are really independent learners already. So I can guide your student who's already decently capable of independent learning, but we can hone it. We can make it better. They write their essay, they come to their tutorial, read through their essay, discuss the essay with the tutor, and the tutor gives them feedback on what they've written, how they're writing. In one sense, just as you have a personal trainer, coach, that's kind of what a tutor is for academics, right? But really this kind of idea of academic coaching that takes advantage of the independence as well as the resources available to a home educated, and the flexibility, because it's intensive. The amount of time that goes into writing an essay every week is a lot. But it works really well with the home education because there's schedule flexibility and there's the opportunity. If the student loves ancient history, here you go. My parents, right, couldn't teach me every subject when I was in high school. They form co-ops and these sorts of things where you draw on the expertise of other parents, as well as I think now there's a growing number of tutors available. I think that's another huge resource for home educated folks, is you can find experts that either really will help your student who's already geared towards a subject and take it further, or if they're struggling, right, and you're as a parent, you can't meet that need directly, there's lots of resources. One of the homeschooling parents in our co-op, he taught physics at the University of Pittsburgh. So he tested out his physics textbook that he was getting published for college freshmen, university freshmen, on us. And it was such a rigorous, intense class. But I learned not only about physics from a physics professor, but I also learned what it looked like to learn to study harder. But we got a really unique learning experience. It was like a half a dozen of us with a physics professor.
And I suppose the logical question that I want to end with is, would you home educate your own children?
Yeah. So my wife and I are definitely excited about home education and home educating our kids. We don't think it's necessary for everyone. I would say that, everyone has different challenges and opportunities that they face in life, but I think the things that we have gained from home education personally, as well as some of the resources available now that really weren't available when I was going through school, I think that there's just a lot of support, a lot of opportunities. And for us, I think we see the possibilities, the options, and the benefits are just really, really significant for home education at this time, especially. So yeah, we're excited. There are things that we want to teach. So my wife is half Argentine. And so she's fluent in Spanish, grew up speaking Spanish. And our son and daughter, we would love them to be bilingual. So that's actually one of the big impetuses for us for home education, is trying to provide them an education that's going to be bilingual. So we're excited about particularly that angle of things. But I think we also really value an education that teaches not just information, but the processes and methods of learning and critical thinking. I guess that's one other thing I would have thrown out about the tutorial, is the emphasis on critical thinking and argumentation is another thing that I love about it. But that's something we would love for our kids, because I think that a lot of the education that I received, that I saw my peers receive, is like a lot of really good information about a subject, but I don't know that a lot of us were really taught how to think, which I think is another great opportunity that home education provides, or can provide, if the parents kind of envision that. So, and I guess one other thing I'll say about why we would home educate is that I think that education is substantially about vision, and passing along that vision just as much as sort of a lot of particulars in different subjects. And I do think that pretty much any education, if you talk with anybody who's had a good educational experience, it usually comes down to the relationship they had with their teacher, and usually whatever passion or interest or vision that teacher had. And I think that if parents who want to home educate can just pass along a vision for life that can answer deep why questions and help their student to think and love learning, I think that in and of itself just goes a really long way. And parents don't even have to have that all in hand when they start, right? My parents, it was definitely something that they learned as they went and grew with us, that I think was also valuable. So for us, I think we're really excited about the vision that we want to pass along to our children for life and learning.
Justin, thank you so much for joining me. I found it really inspirational, and I'm sure everybody listening did too. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad what you guys are doing, and I hope that you are successful.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining the Seatton Education Podcast. Whether you watched us on YouTube or you listened as a podcast, please like, comment, and follow as we discuss how home education can be an achievable alternative to conventional schooling.